Assalamu alaikum, welcome in debate. I am your host Tariq Khan. We will explore and analyze US-China trade war and China's global expansion. Let me bring our guest in program, Miss Hira Khan. You are international trade expert, also expert on globalization and European integration. Miss Hira, thank you so much for joining and welcome in program. How would you describe globalization and global or international trade? Is it beneficial or damaging for any economy of any state?
First of all, Tariq, thank you for having the program and for letting me share a bit of economic discourse, background knowledge, and some trade knowledge and expertise here. The question to qualify or disqualify trade as either good or bad in itself is not as important. I think it's just like saying is eating food good or bad? But what is a more valid question is how much food should you have, or what kind of food should you have? That makes it more, because we know that trade is going on since the existence of mankind, be it from tribal systems. It's just that the distances over time have changed. Princely states, and then we come into the imperial era of colonialization, and we see intercontinental trade going on since the past few hundred centuries. So trade in itself is a good. That's why it is intrinsic to our nature to trade goods and services, because it fulfills our requirements. But what I would like to, but I do know that in the economic discourse and amongst the viewers, there is an opinion of trade having negatives, which is true. Because there would be economic research, there are statistical facts about the negatives of international trade and globalization, such as immigration and globalization causes job loss or unemployment in countries. It causes wage gap between skilled and unskilled labor. So no doubt, when you open your economy to the world, when you globalize, it does bring its negatives. But at the same time, let's also not forget the positives of trade. Before I can conclude your answer, to take an example, Apple is the best example you can give when you talk about globalization or international trade. The development and design is in the USA. The screens might be coming from Korea. The camera and other technology may be from Japan, and the manufacturing is done in China, and then it's used all over the world. So the positive that we take from this example is that it is because of international trade that we have access to cheaper raw material. And why that's important is because when the cost of production goes down, the final cost of a good goes up. And that creates demand for your low-priced good, which means there will be more production of the good, because consumers would consume a good that has a good price because of lower raw materials, which means it generates more employment. So that is a positive of international trade or globalization at the same time. But then it gets very complicated to understand if there are both negatives and positives. So for simplicity's sake, we can always look at countries' examples. We have countries like Canada, which have always been open towards globalization and towards international trade. Then we have countries which are closed, have closed economies, which are not globalizing. It can be their personal preference, such as North Korea, or it can also be imposed by circumstances on them or situations, such as Gaza Strip. It's the best example of a closed economy not doing any international trade. Iran, for example, with all these sanctions on their trade. And then we have a third kind of set of countries. These are countries which have chosen not to globalize or open up to the world up till a certain point, and after that they have become globalized and accepted international trade. Myanmar, Cuba, China itself. So if you see all these three different sets of countries, I think the answer is very clear that globalization and international trade brings a net benefit. So my answer here would be that from a very economic or statistical point of view, very factual, that international trade and globalization has a net benefit for both countries who are involved. But indeed, the opportunities are not equally dispersed. That depends on a country's domestic policy, how much when it is in a globalization agreement, immigration agreement, international trade agreement, how it aligns its domestic policy with the global policy or global efficiency. But here, Tariq, I would actually like to dig deeper into a philosophical debate about globalization, why we are actually doing the program today as well, why it's the hot topic of the 21st century. You see that globalization trade was always done, even when we were living in like 6,000 years ago as tribes, let's say, even during colonial era. But what we have to see is that since after the World War II in 1944, trade is no longer a scenario of supply and demand. Globalization in the world we are living in is not about meeting supply and demand. That Mexico is good in producing bananas, Japan is good in producing motor vehicles. Japan's climate does not support, let's say, bananas, so they would get it from Mexico. Mexico doesn't manufacture cars, they get it from Japan. Trade is no longer just about this anymore. Why I say this is because after the World War II in 1944, the main objective of globalization, or the main drive all of a sudden towards globalization, is because trade has become an instrument of global peace and prosperity. International trade creates interdependence between two countries or more countries, and it's one of the most efficient global way of ensuring peace. And I say this because we see in 1948 that there is GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, for countries to do globalization or international trade, which is the Bible of international trade, basically. And as soon as GATT forms in 1948, if you focus on the timings as well, just after the World War II, we see multinational corporations all over the world. So let's say if Samsung was just in Korea, but now Samsung would be all over the world. Our best example is McDonald's. Always in economics books, it's being used. We see life expectancy, life standards. We really notice that the quality of people on the planet has increased. But it did not stop there. The motive for a global efficiency really picked up when GATT transferred in the 1980s to WTO. Now, WTO is not about forming trade relations between countries. WTO has an objective of globalization, and globalization in itself is basically, if I can put it, to align domestic policy of a country with the global prosperity and global efficiency. And if a country's domestic policy does not align with the global efficiency, then we see in the current world that globalization and international trade are a geopolitical weapon of our century. It never goes to nuclear stockpile. Guns and bombs are not the first way to punish a country anymore. Soon as you see a country having a domestic policy that does not align with your global view, what do we see happening? Iran talks about its nuclear. What happens first? US isolates Iran. There are trade embargoes, sanctions, and complete isolation of Iran. Their goods are not acceptable in the rest of the world. The rest of the world's goods do not make it to them. Russia lands its troops somewhere in some territory. What happens? No guns and bombs. There are sanctions on Russia. And what happens to Russia's economy in those years? So globalization is, if you come out of the discourse of economics, trade is not about goods and services or people anymore. Trade has really become the weapon with which to keep global peace and to keep every country's domestic actions point of view in line with what works best for the world and the global economy in general. So it's really being used also as a tool to punish countries. And it is because of this that I say that globalization has a net benefit, because open economies have fared way more than the closed ones. And I also believe, since I have an economic discourse, I would like to conclude it with some economic theories, because having opinion or belief system is one thing, or seeing statistics or research, But another thing is to like really see theories and models of a subject. And trade is an economic subject. So if you really go into the economic models running from different economists from the 16th century, you would not find a single economic model of equations and graphs that goes against international trade. I would like to just state a few here. For example, if you see Ricardian model of comparative advantage, if you're good at making bananas and another country is good at making car seats or engines, both countries have an advantage in making what they are best endowed with as a resource, because we need to have an understanding that we have limited resources. Not what are resources: land, climate, labor, skill level of the labor, how much technology you have, how much productivity you have. Every country is not endowed with all the resources, and that's where the Ricardian model says that, yeah, okay, if you're good at making bananas, another country is good at making engines, you do trade. Then comes Stopper-Samuelson theorem, Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So if you go into that's the second economic theory about trade, Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. And what do they say in their model? So they are basically trying to tell that when two countries trade, both have a net benefit. It can be that one country benefits more than the other, but you cannot say that one is a winning partner and another is a loser. Both countries benefit. Why? Because both countries are endowed with different resources, and with the exchange of resource, their supply and demand for their common consumer is being met. Then comes Stopper-Samuelson theorem, one of the most complicated theorems, not getting into equations and graphs, but it simply reduces down to saying that at the end of doing trade, which is the most, like for laymen like you and me, the most important thing is that we all live in equality. Equality matters a lot to common citizen. And that's what Stopper-Samuelson theorem proves, that it is only via international trade that the factors of production, their prices equalize. So capital is, of course, capital-intensive goods like a smartphone has more price. Labor-intensive goods like textiles, like clothes, have less price. And it's only when you do international trade of both that the prices of the factors would equalize, because you bring the demand to match the supply. Too much economics, I understand, but I just wanted to give a worldview here also from economic background that the answer to your question is that trade is good. Globalization is good. There is no doubt to it. But it can be that it is more good for one country and not so much for the other. To that we can come as the program goes on. So.
What is the origin and how did the United States-China trade war escalate?
The trade war, as we call it, is basically a war of the tariffs between US and China. When we call it a tariff war, tariff is basically a tax on imports of goods and services of another country. Usually countries like to put a tariff on the goods and services of other country to curb the behavior or their dependence on the other country. And this is exactly what has happened between US and China. It's basically a war of tariffs that US began with putting tariffs on Chinese goods and services entering the US borders for consumption purposes. But if you ask me about the origin, as I said earlier, China was the closed economy up until 1978. It's only then that China began to have an open economic policy. They brought about heavy reformation of their industrial sector, and they opened themselves up to the world. It was very celebrated and applauded. Even in the West, we see in 2001 when China joined the WTO, it was very much, US was one of the biggest applauder and celebrator of the fact. Why? Because there was a perception that in becoming a member of the WTO, a country is choosing to play fair. It is going to play by the rules of the WTO, which every other member follows. Especially in the West, there was a worldview that China will be like any other capitalistic economy. But then what happens? You and I and viewers, of course, get to only know that China is not playing fair when Donald Trump, it's only in 2016 that Donald Trump brings it to the media. He puts it in front of the world that despite being the member of the WTO, China is not playing by the fair rules. And it's only after 2016 that China is being called the factory of the world. And as much as somebody would like being called as, I'm the factory of the world, but actually it's not a positive title. It's a very negative title being given to China. And the main reason for this is that China is being seen and it is to quite a large degree true that China is not playing fair. China's level playing field is not leveled. China favors Chinese companies and corporations, and the amount of subsidies that they get and the support they have from their government is not the same as what Western and international companies get in China. But by virtue of China being the manufacturing hub of the world, because of its it has a competitive advantage, as I stated before, that any Western company or multinational company would want to have its manufacturing unit in China. But do they get the same support as a Chinese company gets in China? No. And this is what is Trump's main argument. And the origin of the war in itself might be since China is open to the world, but it has only been highlighted by ex-President Trump, and this frustration of US over China's unfair behavior is basically what has escalated the trade war.
How would you distinguish US-China bilateral trade behavior to each other? Who is offensive and defensive?
I think it won't just be me. I think the behaviors are very well distinguished that US is the offensive player. This is because the problem itself is felt by the US. The problem arises because it's the US that has a problem with China. And US has definitely been offensive without taking any shame. US has been upfront about it. Why I would say it is because US is the first one to put tariffs on Chinese goods, and not just any percentage higher tariffs. US started with doubling the tariff on Chinese goods and services. And here we should not forget that China's biggest export market is USA. So majority of Chinese goods, their export partner, the biggest export partner is USA, and that puts double tariffs. So like taxes Chinese goods entering the US territory by double, to which China has a reaction, of course, which would be not surprising at all, that China puts tariffs on the US goods entering China. But it did not stop there. US ended up tripling the tariff. So US is on the offensive side. And another reason why US is on the offensive side is because we really, over the past few months or over the past year, if we see the terminology that the US state and its officials have used against China, if you focus on the words spy, attack, unfair, to an extent that Donald Trump went on to call it, I'm not sure if but we have to, because he said it, that China is raping our country. If that is the terminology, then you can already see the offense that US has taken and how it is coming out against China. So definitely it's US who is the offensive player.
How would you explain technological competition between the US and China? Does it have any impact on the ongoing US-China trade war?
First of all, Tariq, I think as humans, as personally, I feel very, I don't know, I don't take much honor in the fact that when we see two leading or biggest, best performing countries of the world, when we talk about them, we don't talk about their competition over standards, over health, over life expectancy, over are Chinese people on average happier than US people, over a happiness index, over better medical facilities, over who brings the vaccine out. It is, I think it is a moment to reflect on that when we talk about the competition between two leading or best performing economies of the world, that what we are affected by and care the most about is the technology competition. I mean, does technology really matter so much that we are talking about the competition of technology more than a competition of human happiness, life, standards? Well, in fact, it does. Technology is a big part of the US-China trade war. It's actually a technological war. Reason being that We are living in a time where 5G is the way into the future. Um, what is 5G? For first, let's make clear because I want to elaborate on it because it's a very important topic of subtopic of our topic today. 5G is a smart future. 5G means everything we did, we do, we will do, we are thinking to do will be on the internet, coupled with artificial intelligence. So wherever we are, it will all be connected to the internet. This means that there is a lot of data, basically all our lives and everything, all our planning, everything we are working on, and not just citizens but also the governments, the states are planning of which iPhone model is coming in the future and what features will it have is already known, let's say, to its competitor. So it's all the information that will be available on the internet. That's what 5G will do. So 5G is basically, or technology is basically the way of life in the future. First, it's very important to like elaborate why technology is more important here than other things or other kinds of competitions. At the same time, what makes it about US and China is that China has Huawei, as we all know. Huawei is currently the biggest, the largest maker of telco and network providing services in the world. It has outgrown all its competitors. And what makes it interesting is that it is a Chinese multinational, it is a Chinese corporation. But okay, fine. So what? Then another thing that we need to know, which US knows before anyone else, is that China has a law. Article 7 of Chinese law states very clearly that all corporations, companies, manufacturers, whatever you want to call them, businesses in China owe their allegiance to the Chinese government. If you want me to really use the words within the law, the words included in the law are cooperate, support, and assist the state intelligence. So all Chinese companies, it's embedded in their dogma to say that they constitutionally have to assist, support, and cooperate with the government, the state. And Huawei being a Chinese company, and having such a law to follow, we don't know the degree to which they will follow it. It's not talked about, of course, but this is what US is scared of or is fearful about. This is why US thinks that China's technology will end up being a spy. It will be a cyber attack. This is why they are calling it a national security threat. This is the reason US has banned, has restricted Huawei, and also other Western countries have followed. Because in the future, your data will be your only asset on the balance sheet. It will not be your nuclear stockpile. It will not be which military is strongest. It will not be whether your people live longer than other group of people. It will not be whether your export data shows you're the biggest exporter in the world. No. It is data. It's a war of data, and Huawei being the leading 5G providing company for the future is a threat. So, but what is ironic here, because let's keep matters fun, is that what US calls as a security, a concern for their security. I also feel that in this argument there is somewhat an insecurity. So it's ironic, but it's actually an insecurity of US, because this technological competition exists and will always exist because, as I said, if internet, if 5G, and if data is the future, then the one that has control over it will be the leading player, will be the hostile power in the world. And right now we know US is the main player. We like to call it superpower. Let's just call it a predominant power in the world. It's USA, and USA would not want to give up its status to China or any other country. For now, it's China because of Huawei, because of 5G, but it could have been any other country. And therefore, we see that this technological war, which is not much talked about, is actually one of the strongest points, let's say, in this trade war.
Do you think trade war between China and US has any impact on European market as well as global economic growth?
Definitely. Even if it was another country, It could be France going on a war with Germany. It could be China going on a war with Japan. It could be US with the UK, or UK with the EU bloc as it is right now. It will definitely have an impact. And also the IMF has already predicted that ever since there is US-China trade war, the economic growth has slowed down. We have statistics showing it, but it is not surprising. Why? Because and this is where, when originally I talked about global efficiency, if you remember, if you recall in the start of the program, global prosperity, global peace, why it became so important after World War II, because we saw that to have development, to have growth, to have peace in the world, to have stability in the world, that is very important because that helps make investment decisions. When countries like China and US are going to go in a war, or it seems alarming that they might go in a war, it's the investment decisions by big corporations that stop. And that causes a downturn in growth because, of course, growth only happens when things grow, when money is put into making a project happen. So definitely the answer is a yes to it. And again, I would like to reiterate on my point that it just strengthens further the point that trade, international trade, is the new geopolitical weapon in the world, because soon as China and US are reducing their trade volume by putting tariffs, by making goods go high priced for each other, it's resulting in on an impact on the global economy and the economy of the two countries themselves. But for that matter, just to make it clear, it could have been any countries who go. It will definitely impact the bloc, their regional neighbors, and then it impacts the whole global economy for sure. And then on top of it, we've had coronavirus, which is also a part of the US-China trade war, because it happens right at the time when the two countries are at their historical low. And as you asked me before, who is acting more offensive? Of course, USA, because they end up calling it the China virus, just because it originated in China, and it becomes, and that's again a terminology being used by them that, and we've seen the global economy has indeed slowed down. So the answer is, of course, yes.
Who will win a trade dispute, China or United States of America? What will be the end? Do you see any new developments in China, United States of America's relations?
What we can say for a fact is that right now, or since last year, the relationships between US and China have been historically at their lowest. But there are a number of things that I would like to point out quickly. Some of them would be the same points, such as we see a pandemic is being called as China virus. I mean, that is really the lowest of the lowest. US is taking very radical propositions to shut down ties with China. For example, we see that the Pacific Treaty that was being discussed in the last year, US backed out of it. It was not a part of it. At the same time, we see US making a whole fiasco, whether you want to call it a fiasco or you want to call it a legitimate claim, out of their national security at threat because of Huawei. And then just one country going against a company, US against Huawei as a multinational, because they basically see Huawei, because of the article and the law in China that I just discussed, as not just a company, but as Chinese government at the back of it because of that law in their constitution. But another fact to notice here about the offense US has taken, just to tell you where this war is going, is that US has stopped its funding to the World Health Organization only because during this pandemic, the WHO is cozying up, or, is neutral and is what it should be towards China or any country for that matter because of a pandemic going on. And the US stops its funding to the WHO. So when you see arguments like this, and then you see President Biden, who will now be leading the US, it seems that he will also not lighten up on China. It seems that he will remain tough on China. So we cannot predict when the war will be resolved, or whether it will head from being a trade war to maybe more than just that. Maybe it will affect immigration. Maybe it will affect employment. Maybe it will become racial war, which it already has, with the pandemic being called as a yellow virus or China virus. Maybe there will be new features in the war, but just to give you like an example of stopping of funding or not taking a lead on international forums, platforms, agreements, treaties where China has a presence. US is not taking a stage in those places. So yeah, we don't know how the future will turn out, but it will definitely not cool off anytime soon.
Who is the biggest economy, United States of America or China? Does the world depend on China or the United States of America? What do you think?
All right, it's a very interesting question. I wouldn't say that we can frame it in such a way that all the rest of the world can depend on China or only depends on USA. But what we know for a fact is that the bigger an economy is in terms of the goods and services that it provides, the more it influences the rest of the other economies, big or small, and the less impact it takes of other economies and what happens with them. So the bigger an economy, of course, the more influence it will have on the world. But who is the biggest? I would just like to say here, for example, if you have two kids around about the same age, you cannot predict if 10, 15 years later who will be the tallest. You cannot tell. But what you can do is you can measure their height gain every now and then, every month, to see who is growing up faster. And that is what matters, that where China and US will be in 20 years from now or 50 years, we cannot say for certain, but what we can see is where is the hint, which way are they heading? And you know, as I said, you measure who is growing up faster in height. And I think the answer there is very simple, because if you see what is happening around us, you see China started the new Silk Route, the Belt and Road Initiative. Why I mentioned it is because the Belt and Road Initiative is not just about China and some countries who are allies or, would potentially, it seems like they are more friends with China, let's say, but also European nations who are a part of the EU and who are a part of NATO are backing up and supporting China. They are a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then you see that just recently China signed the biggest trade agreement in the world with China and 14 other Pacific nations, which form 30% of the global economy. Since we both are from Pakistan, I would not fail to mention CPEC here, that China is even going on to do such partnerships with underdeveloped to developing countries. So, yeah, when you see all these things, you see where Huawei is, you see where China is heading. And let's not forget that China was only created in 1949. So if you see the exponential curve of China, I think that gives a good hint, unless, of course, you never know what happens. But yeah, we can see that who's playing really hard here. Yeah.
Hira, thank you so much for your time, your valuable analysis, precious analysis on the topic, and thank you so much again.
No problem. My pleasure. My pleasure.